And it is a great joy and honor for me to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Eileen Guenther, who's giving our class today. Eileen and I have known each other for 25 years, since we were 4 years old, if you can believe it. And we've worked together in many capacities because Eileen has served in more roles than I can count on the national, regional, and local levels of the American Guild of Organists. Most importantly, being elected our president by a membership of about 15,000 at the time. It's a great honor to be president of the American Guild of Organists, and it's a great honor for us to have Eileen Guenther here with us today. Her book, which you will be hearing about, in their own words, Slave Life and the Power of Spirituals, has now entered its 6th printing. And we have copies of the book here. If you would like to have a copy of the book, they're $30. I'll be right over here at the piano after the class if you would like to have one and take one home. Perhaps you can convince Eileen to autograph it for you as well. She'll be here for the afternoon concert. That's enough for me. You're here to hear Eileen, and it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Eileen Guenther.
Thank you, Tony. I won't keep turning around to people. We have been friends. I wouldn't have said the numbers, but hey, he did. I kind of call those numbers unlisted myself. But it's a great pleasure. We've been talking about this a long time. He's worked very, very hard on it. And the first thing you need to do is tell me, is the mic okay? Yes. Okay. That's good. I'm also grateful to Teddy for the music, and you'll get to hear him this afternoon as well. So take a peek at these. The time frame doesn't allow us to dwell on the slides, but there are a few slides here that I just kind of couldn't resist. So we'll go ahead, starting to talk about the history, and saying from the very beginning, I've worked a lot of years on this subject, and I approach it still today with great humility. I'm profoundly honored to be asked to share my research with people like Tony and people like you who are also passionate about it. My role today is that of an African griot, or storyteller, connecting the various components that make up this great tapestry. When we talk about spirituals, we also talk about religion, and we talk about slavery, and there's no way around it. And when I say talk, I'll be doing some of the talking, but the most important words are the ones that will be read by our readers here, which are the words of those who had been enslaved. They come to us 3 different ways. Of course, we've got the spirituals text. That's obvious. Then we have 204 book-length narratives, such as this one, which is a first-person narrative from a slave in Delaware. And there are 204 books of this sort that were written, if they were literate, or dictated by those who had been enslaved. Then there are 2,300 interviews conducted by the Federal Writers Project between 1936 and 38. And this was the post-Depression. People needed jobs. And so they sent teachers and scientists and writers and anyone who could go to the South. Any state that had slaves, they went there. There were about 100,000 former slaves living at the time. And they had questions of them, and this is gold. This is first-person stuff. You can't get any more primary than this. And they went around, and they, like I said, they had the list of questions, which are now lodged in the Library of Congress if you wanted to check it. And some people who were living, say, down the road from those who had been their owners, they didn't want to talk. They didn't want something to happen to their pension. They were just very, close-mouthed about what was it like. And then there were others who said, "You want to talk about slavery? I'll tell you about slavery." And they wouldn't stop talking. Somebody was finally listening. So that's where this gold comes from. The folks that wrote and talked were from a broad spectrum of those who had been enslaved. Those who worked in the house, those who worked in the field, cooperative and rebellious individuals, urban and rural slaves, and runaways. And 2, as historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. reminds us, No group of slaves anywhere at any other period in history has left such a large repository of testimony about the horrors of becoming the legal property of another human being. Now, you might be asking yourselves, do spirituals still matter today? It's been quite a while. Well, it's not actually been quite as long as we might think, but I believe that they do. First, they have the ability to speak to us regardless of our situations. They remain part of today's culture and are sung at churches and schools and university concerts. And we're really only 4 or 5, some would say even 3 generations away from slavery. So while it feels like a very long distance, it's not that long. And much of the practice of that era is still informing, for better or worse, the practices of things that happen today. Should spirituals be sung by anybody besides African Americans? Now that is a big subject. We could spend the rest of the time on that, but I don't think we shall. But I have done a lot of work with that, and when I say work, I have a cadre of African American conductors, scholars, and theologians who are my people, my team, and whenever I have a question, I go to them, because being white, my answer is not necessarily going to be the right one. I have to consult people who have the lived experience, whereas I have the academic and research experience. It's a different thing. And so they would say absolutely yes. They would also say, yes, you must say slave, not enslaved, because that was another big topic, which is now being revisited in the greater media. Spirituals connect us with each other. They are human concerns. In his I Have a Dream speech, we know the part where Mahalia goes, Martin, tell him about the dream. Well, this isn't just that. This is another places in there. He encourages, he enjoins African Americans to sing, My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, whether they really feel it or not. And he wants the whites to say, and he was more specific here, all of God's children, black and white, Jews, Gentiles, he gives a whole list of things to sing, free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last. Because we learn each other's stories by singing each other's songs. These first-person narratives make us witnesses to the lives of those enslaved from the inside out.
This certain song they would sing as a chorus, the words which to many would seem unmeaningful jargon, but which nevertheless were full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of these songs would do more to impress some minds, while the horrible character of other than the horrible character of slavery, than the reading of the whole volumes of philosophy on the subject would do. Frederick Douglass, Maryland.
Frederick Douglass is one of my total heroes. He wrote not 1, not 2, but 3 autobiographies. And sometimes he quoted himself, which made footnoting a real fun experience. Which of those books did it come from? I made a note of FD, but that didn't tell me enough when it came down to really, anyway. Anthropologically, we all share a common humanity and a common origin in Africa. This connection means that each of us has a vested interest in the well-being of every other person. We're related. We are brothers, sisters, cousins, whatever you want to say. Africans were first brought involuntarily to the shores of the Americas in 1501, first brought to North America, and a date you probably know, to Jamestown in 1619, a little over 400 years ago. There are no hard figures for the number of Africans taken from their homes and forced to labor in foreign lands between the 16th and the mid-19th centuries, but estimates run between 10 and 11 million on one end to 20 million on the other. Just wrapping your brain around these figures. I see some heads going, yeah. It's horrific. They were transported in the bellies of ships, a voyage called the Maafa in Kiswahili, or the Middle Passage, or the diaspora, or the triangular slave trade. And the voyages numbered, and here we have amazing numbers, between 20 and 35,000 voyages on the low end, all the way up to 60,000 on the other. If any of you ever go to the African American Heritage Museum in Washington, have you started at the bottom? Because at the bottom is where there is a slave ship that was crashed off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. And that is one of the first ones, if not the first, that we have the ballast, we have the shackles, we have the artifacts from that ship. So at the point that someone says, oh, you're making this stuff up. No, we're not making this stuff up. And they have, you know, an amazing history. I've gotten acquainted with the guys who discovered the ship, and when I've taken groups to South Africa, we go to their lab and see the newest things that have happened, and it's just truly awe-inspiring. Captives brought little with them on this middle passage except their faith, their desire to survive, and the melodies and rhythms of their homelands. So when we say, where did spirituals come from? Africa. Not directly, but the melodies and the rhythms were. And then the text, you know, came in later. West Africa specifically, where a great number of Africans thrust into slavery had called home. It boasts a rich musical culture and a strong oral tradition of storytelling with personal and tribal history all codified in song by the griot, who was a very popular person in tribes, especially when they kind of flattered the tribal chief and said nice things about how accomplished the tribe was. Spirituals weren't composed in the customary sense of the term, but created. Somebody starts to sing. You start to sing, and then you start to sing, and then you'll start to sing. And by the time we get to you, it may not even be the same melody or the same text. You may have added to it, and that's just how oral tradition works. The songs that mattered were owned by the community, and they were sung. And the songs that didn't speak to the community, they didn't keep singing. So there's not so much agreement about whether they sang in unison or part. Somebody will sing, we only sang in part. Somebody else says, oh, we always sang in unison. Doesn't really matter. And we also don't know for sure how many were written. Some say hundreds, others say thousands. The best estimate I have been able to nail down is about 800. That's still a huge body of music, if you think about it. The melodies and the rhythms we sing today may not be exactly what's printed on the page. If Tony plays something that's a little different from what you think you're reading in the hymnal, is he missing notes? No, 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 no. He is playing a different version. And the people, I mean, it used to be like, you know, right is what I like, not right is what I don't like. But it's not so much that, but just that everybody was different. So the nice folks that went to the Georgia Sea Islands, they were there as educators, but they heard the music and they were entranced by it. So they started writing it down. And there's 120 spirituals in this book, an amazing foreword about how hard they had to work. There are more steps in the scales that they were using, which were not based on the 12 half steps diatonic scale that we have on our keyboard instruments and most of the others. So they had a hard time getting the notes down. What really made them crazy was the dialect. Think about this. These folks came from all over Africa, many different dialects. South Africa alone has, I think, 17, a lot of official dialects. And so they had to figure out how to communicate with each other. Drums worked for a while until people figured out that they were communicating with the drums. This was not just making a nice rhythm, and so they took the drums away. So the dialect, it's difficult, and it's really hard for choirs today to figure out what to do with dialect. They don't want to sound uneducated, but the fact is that these folks were amazingly creative in figuring out how to communicate, and then had to know enough English or figure that out so that if they were given a task, they would not be punished for not having completed it correctly. Happened a lot. They didn't understand what it was. And so the whole language and dialect thing is a subject for another time, Tony, if you want to come back and, wherever he is, and we can talk about that at another kind of workshop. But anyway, this is the very first collection of spirituals from 1867, and we owe a lot to those folks. We can talk briefly about religion because spirituals come out of a religious experience. Most were composed after 1800, the era of the Second Great Awakening, when missionaries began bringing Christianity to the slaves. First it was thought, oh no, because if you become a Christian and join the church, does that make you free? Well, that was a problem for those who were owning, so then there was this law. Virginia had a lot of the first early worst laws, and one of the Virginia laws says, no, 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 you got civil law and you have religious law, and they don't mix. So you can become a Christian, and you're not free. Then, okay, they settled that. But eventually the owners figured they might be more docile, they might be better workers if they were answering to another authority. So Christianity began to spread. All African peoples enslaved in America were not Christian by any means, but many of them were, and many of them in their writing and their interviews credited Christianity with basically their ability to survive. There were several ways that they worshiped. They could walk to a white church, and I say walk because, as one enslaved woman said, we walked the 8 to 10 miles one way because Master didn't allow his mules to be used none on Sundays. So they're walking all that distance. That's one way. Then there might be a plantation, a worship house on the plantation that was known. It wasn't secret. But who was preaching mattered. And if there was a preacher, very often black preachers, but if they got too close to what we would call liberation theology or anything about equality, they weren't invited back. Couldn't have that equality stuff. But the worship that mattered most to them was the worship way far away, secret worship out under the brush, where they created maybe even somewhat called a cathedral of tree limbs that would come together. And they might have benches or not. I mean, it kind of depended on all that. But that was the worship that mattered.
That old white preaching wasn't nothing. Those old white preachers used to talk with their tongues without saying nothing. But Jesus taught us slaves to talk with our hearts. Nancy Williams, Virginia.
Jesus was a complicated figure, a number of different facets. He was both God and human. He had suffered the way they did because he was triumphant over death. He was also seen as a deliverer and a friend. Wrapping all these qualities in music, they sang, Jesus is a rock in a weary land. I want Jesus to walk with me, and give me Jesus.
In answer to the question of, how did you bear it all? How did you live? The response was, I couldn't e'er done it all, dear, without Master Jesus. He's held me up. I'd or died long ago without him. Former Alabama slave.
Amen.
Amen.
1793 was a very interesting year. It was a year that Canada welcomed those who had been enslaved as free people in Canada. But it also was a year, as you can see, the invention of the cotton gin. Cotton had been a major crop, but with the gin, they could process more of it more quickly. And what did that mean? They needed more labor to create more cotton to feed the gins. So it was really a very dark day for those who were enslaved because of the extensive pressure. And places like Virginia began to be not so much tobacco or cotton producing places, but because their soil was really becoming depleted, but they began to produce slaves. So they would buy people who were particularly amenable or physically able to make babies. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff all put together there. Narratives tell the story of life on the plantation and slavery itself. So did the spirituals. The owners found so many ways to punish those who were enslaved. It was diabolical. Why did they punish them? Because there was no other reason for them to work than to avoid punishment. And they write about that. Frederick Douglass is totally clear at great length about the role of punishment. And when I was writing the book, I worked on it for about 10 years, I guess, maybe longer. And I had to stop because the punishment stuff was just sadistic. I'm not exaggerating, I'm really not. At any rate, of all the terrible things that happened to people, the worst thing that could happen was to be sold or be threatened to be sold away from your family. Flat out, and they also said that. This next narrative actually took place in Washington, D.C., a plantation, the Riley Plantation on Old Georgetown Road, if some of you may have spent some time around there. And it came to be used in a book that put the face on slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
In consequence of my master's decease, it became necessary to sell the estate and the slaves in order to divide the property among the heirs. My brothers and sisters were bid off one by one, while my mother, holding my hand, looked on in an agony of grief. She was bought by a man named Isaac R., residing in Montgomery County, Maryland. And then I was offered to the assembled purchasers. My mother, half distracted with the parting forever for all of her children, pushed through the crowd while the bidding for me was going on to the spot where R was standing. She fell at his feet and clung to his knees, entreating him in tones that only a mother could command, to buy her baby as well as herself, and spare to her one of her little ones at least. Will it? Can it be believed that this man, thus appealed to, was capable not merely of turning a deaf ear to her supplication, but of disengaging himself from her with such violent blows and kicks as to reduce her to the necessity of creeping out of his reach and mingling the groan of her bodily suffering with the sobs of a breaking heart. I was bought by a stranger at 5 or 6 years of age. Josiah Henson, Maryland.
As successful escapee John Holmes puts it, I'll go or die in attempt of trying. I'll walk as long as there's land, and if I come to the sea, I'll swim till I get drowned. The escapee goes on to say, I never expect you'll see me again. If they try to take me, I'll fight till I die. But if it so happens that they master me, I'll never tell them where I came from.
Secrecy was essential. I'll never tell them where I came from. That was a fine thing for him to promise not to do, because saying where he came from meant that people could go back, and the whole thing of finding people and punishing their families, it was just horrendous. The term Underground Railroad has several possible origins, the most likely being an escapee whose name was Tice Davids, jumping into the Ohio River as he was fleeing. And his master was following, and as soon as he got to the other side, he just disappeared. And people said, oh, it was like there was an underground road. Well, that eventually morphed into Underground Railroad as the railroad began to be built across the country. And we can just barely touch the tip of the iceberg, and I'm sitting here looking at what can we cut, because things are never quite the same length as you think they're going to be when you time them at your computer yourself. There were lots of forms of resistance in the era of slavery, from breaking farm equipment to poisoning the owner's food to injuring people, but the ultimate form of resistance was escape, going north. Over the Jordan, to Canaan, going home, all terms that were part of the vocabulary of the enslaved and their dream.
Sometimes the slaves would run away. Their masters was so mean to them that could cause them to run away. Sometimes they'd live in caves. How'd they get along? They got along all right with what other folks is slipping to them. And they'd steal hogs, chickens, and anything else they could get in their hands. Some white people would help too, for there was some white people who didn't believe in slavery. Yes, they'd try to find them slaves that run away, and if they found them, they'd beat them, or they'd sell them to somebody else. Sally Brown.
We're going to skip through some of these, look really quickly. I can read. Challenge to escape. They didn't know where they were. There was distance, swamps, rivers, finding food, escaping wild animals, sheer fear of the unknown. Many of them had not been off the plantation. They didn't know where they were going. And if other slaves would betray them, which is, a really difficult situation, and the punishment that waited an unsuccessful escape. Factors, the timing, was it going to be spring, where there was more food in the fields? Was it going to be winter? They only walked basically at night. They could do 12 to 15 miles a day. Hard labor, punishment, all had to do with escape. Hunger and humiliation. If someone had been punished badly or had been humiliated, they're saying, I'm not doing this anymore. You can't keep doing this to me. I'm leaving. To be reunited with your families, to avoid being sold. But the most important was a simple desire not to be anybody's slave any longer.
I would rather die than go back. That's a subtle point with me, not on account of ill treatment of the person, but I could not stand the idea of being held by another man as chattel. William L. Hubbard.
Professional slave catchers were the bane of their existence. They were poor whites most of the time. Occasionally there was an African or a black, but mostly they were whites, who would just look out for runaways. They wanted to catch somebody, and it was a gift to them to find somebody who didn't have a pass. But if they had passes, that didn't always matter. What do? You rip it up. If you have freedom papers, if somebody didn't really want to acknowledge the validity of that, they'd rip them up. There was no other way to prove. And people were, I mean, it was just this vicious cycle over and over. But the treatment of the slave catchers and the patrollers, there's a lot that's happening today that is really rooted in those practices of a lack of respect and a desire to catch somebody out having done something. If we can skip to reading 8.
Catching runaway slaves is a money-making business. If after advertising no owner appears, they may be sold to the highest bidder, and certain fees are allowed the finder for his services, at all events, even if reclaimed. A mean white considers it a godsend to meet an unknown slave without a pass. Solomon Northrop.
This is a Solomon Northrop of the 12 Years a Slave. If any of you saw the movie, he was in Washington, D.C., and somebody spiked his drink and captured him. He was a free man, musician. Spiked his drink, captured him, and he served 12 years in slavery, although he never should have. I mean, Harriet Tubman also, so many stories of duplicitous behavior. We're going to, okay, whom could they trust is a big thing when they were escaping, because they needed food. Who could supply them food? If somebody said, oh, you can go down the way here and make the first left, that could be somebody that was going to direct them back to a plantation where they'd be recaptured. They couldn't tell whom to trust, which is a terrifically vulnerable position to be in. There were a couple of disastrous slave laws, and we don't have time to go a lot into them, but personal descriptions were part of posters like this and that. After 1850, everybody was a posse. You know, if you found someone running away, you were obligated to capture them and turn them in. If you didn't, you could be fined or jailed. If you helped them, you could be fined or jailed. I mean, it was a total disaster. And that, of course, abolition had begun a little bit earlier. And you all here in Wilmington, I just have to mention really quickly, I assume you know all of this, but sometimes people don't, even when they live someplace. And I'm just going to, slave posters here, Abolition, Garrison, the first abolitionist newspaper up in Boston. Then we have Wilmington. Did you know this was called the last stop before freedom? Yeah, I mean, that's it's amazing. And I've gone around town and tried to figure out where the places were that Garrett had. Well, this was what his house looked like, but it's not there now. There's an office building standing there. And I am just so moved by this that even though you've seen it 50,000 times, just encourage you to go and spend some time with it. And look at the people, look at the shackles on the, at the bottom of the base of this. It's just exceedingly moving, and I think something of which the city of Wilmington should be really proud, that you're holding up two heroes. We were going to talk more about Harriet Tubman. We won't. We were also going to talk more about Frederick Douglass, because both of them had a role for music. Code songs. Douglass talks brilliantly about how important they were. In fact, we will go ahead and do that reading right now, if we could. Reading 9.
A keen observer might have detected on a repeated singing of, "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan," something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. Frederick Douglass, Maryland.
There was huge courage on the part of everybody involved in this whole enterprise of escape, what one of the conductors called the Upper Ground Railroad. Courage on the part of whites who risked their fortune. I mean, Garrett was sued, basically went bankrupt from having helped slaves, and he said, that's okay, I will keep doing this. I will put another story on my house if that's what it takes to help people to freedom. Of course, for those who were escaping, they were risking everything, but then they felt like they had everything to gain. If we could go to reading 10. There's so much about Tubman that is fairly well known. This is where she was as a child. And I can just keep going through here if you'll read.
I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to do: liberty or death. And if I could not have one, I would have the other. For no man should take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as long as my strength lasted. And when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me. Harriet Tubman, Maryland.
Music was a lot of the escape experience under Harriet, and Go Down Moses was a song that she sang when she would go ahead and scope things out and leave people hiding, and then when it was safe to come out, she sang one song, and when it wasn't safe to come out, she sang, this is really soft and subtle, of course, they couldn't get caught. She sang another. So Go Down Moses is a song that was sung when it was not safe to come out of hiding. And if you all can see this, we'll do one verse, oops, with our great leader here. And you are the responders, and you probably know it anyway without even looking up, and then we'll all sing the refrain together. Sing this if anybody else is around. They were very careful about what they sang when there were people who were not in the know and who could think that escape was just, going to life eternal, going to heaven. The same songs for that are the songs that also were escaping, going over the River Jordan, which was over the Ohio River, going to Canada or whatever. There's just so much to talk about and so much to be grateful for. And if we can just say this song, this reading together as a way that we close, I think that would be a nice way for us to end it. Can you see that well enough? If you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. That was her motto. She carried a rifle, and if someone said, oh, my feet hurt, oh, whatever, I've got blisters, I'm hungry, she says, you're welcome to go back, but I'll shoot you first. And she never, as she put it, I never lost a passenger. So I hope for all of us to have a sense of courage and vision and figuring out some way that we can make a difference like these very, very brave folks did. So thank you. We
We
thank
have
Teddy
time for
especially.
about 1 or 2 questions, and then we have to go on to the 11:15 service. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. We can ask it into the microphone. Questions? Okay, thank you. We hope to see everyone back here at 3 o'clock for this concert. Thank you.